The heat in Belo Horizonte on July 8, 2014 was not just atmospheric. It was a heavy, suffocating weight composed of the hopes, dreams, and historical anxieties of 200 million Brazilian souls. If you walked through the streets of Rio de Janeiro, Sao Paulo, or Minas Gerais that afternoon, you would have seen a nation painted entirely in canary yellow and green. This was supposed to be the moment of ultimate redemption, a geopolitical and cultural exorcism 64 years in the making. Ever since the tragic disaster of the 1950 Maracanazo, where Brazil lost the World Cup on home soil to Uruguay, the country had carried a collective inherited trauma. The 2014 FIFA World Cup was explicitly designed to cure that wound. But within 90 minutes inside the Estadio Mineirão, that dream did not just evaporate. It was systematically, clinically, and brutally dismantled in a footballing massacre that would permanently alter the landscape of sports history. This is the definitive, untamed, and harrowing story of the 7-1 match between Brazil and Germany, a sporting. To understand the sheer magnitude of the catastrophe, one must first understand the psychological tightrope Brazil had been walking throughout the tournament. The Seleção, managed by Luiz Felipe Scolari, the tactical mastermind who had led them to their last World Cup glory in 2002, was not a vintage, free-flowing Brazilian side. They were a team fueled almost entirely by raw emotion, intense nationalism, and an overwhelming, borderline toxic pressure to win. Every single match felt like a gladiatorial battle. During the national anthems, the players would scream the lyrics, tears streaming down their faces, gripping each other's shoulders with a desperate intensity. They were carrying the weight of an entire subcontinent on their backs. A subcontinent that had spent billions of dollars on stadiums amid massive civil protests, hoping that a sixth World Cup trophy would justify the sacrifice. By the time they reached the semifinals, the cracks in the armor were gaping. Brazil had scraped past Chile on penalties in the round of 16, a match so emotionally draining that Scolari had to call in a sports psychologist to help the players stop crying. Then came the quarterfinal against Colombia. Brazil won the battle, but lost the war. In the dying minutes of that brutal match, Colombian defender Juan Camilo Zúñiga flew into the back of Neymar Jr., Brazil's golden boy, their talisman, and the undisputed focal point of their entire offensive strategy. The impact fractured a vertebra in Neymar's back. The image of Neymar being airlifted via helicopter from the training camp. Brazil was heading into a collision course with Germany without its best attacker and its best defender. Yet, instead of adopting a cautious, pragmatic approach to compensate for these devastating losses, the Brazilian camp leaned heavily into melodrama. They arrived at the Mineirão wearing Força Neymar hats. During the national anthem, stand-in captain David Luiz and goalkeeper Julio Cesar held up Neymar's number 10 jersey, as if their teammate had perished in battle rather than suffered a football injury. It was an extraordinary display of emotional vulnerability, a hyperinflated state of mind that the German machine, characterized by ice-cold efficiency and rigorous tactical discipline, was ready to exploit. The German national team under Joachim Löw was the antithesis of Brazilian chaos. They had spent a decade rebuilding their footballing infrastructure, transitioning from a rigid physical style to a breathtaking blend of high-speed passing, positional fluidness, and ruthless German precision. They didn't rely on emotion. They relied on geometry, space creation, and an almost telepathic understanding between their core players, many of whom played together at Bayern Munich. While Brazil spent the days leading up to the match weeping for Neymar, Germany spent it practicing how to exploit David Luiz's tendency to abandon his defensive position. When the Mexican referee Marco Rodriguez blew the opening whistle, the atmosphere inside the stadium was an absolute cauldron of noise. For the first few minutes, Brazil tried to use the crowd's energy to launch a furious assault. They pressed high, playing with an adrenaline-fueled intensity that temporarily masked their structural flaws. Oscar found space on the wing, Marcelo let fly a speculative shot that drifted wide. To the untrained eye, Brazil looked energetic. To Joachim Low and his staff on the German bench, Brazil looked completely unprotected. They had no midfield anchor. Fernandinho and Luis Gustavo were pushed far too high, leaving a massive, yawning chasm between the midfield and a makeshift backline led by David Luiz and Dante. The punishment began in the 11th minute, arriving not with a thunderbolt, but with a basic textbook set piece. Germany won a corner on the right side. Toni Kroos swung a beautifully weighted ball toward the back post. The Brazilian marking was non-existent. David Luiz lost his man completely, and Thomas Müller, a player whose genius lies entirely in finding spaces that shouldn't exist, stepped away from his marker and casually volleyed the ball past an exposed Julio Cesar. 1-0 to Germany. The stadium went momentarily quiet, but the fans quickly resumed chanting, believing this was just a minor setback. They had no idea they had just witnessed the opening notes of a footballing funeral march. For the next 10 minutes, Brazil tried to respond, but their attacks were frantic and devoid of any real imagination. They were playing on impulse, while Germany was playing chess. Every time a Brazilian player lost the ball, the German transition was lightning fast, slicing through the non-existent Brazilian midfield like a hot knife through butter. Then came the 23rd minute, the moment the psychological dam broke completely, and the match transformed from a competitive sporting event into a historic humiliation. The Germans advanced with terrifying ease. Toni Kroos found Miroslav Klose inside the box. Klose's first shot was blocked by Julio Cesar, but the rebound fell right back to the veteran striker. With the calmness of a seasoned assassin, Klose slotted the ball into the net. It was his 16th career World Cup goal, breaking the all-time record previously held by the Brazilian legend Ronaldo, who happened to be watching from the commentary booth in the stadium. The symbolism was devastating. The German striker had just broken a sacred Brazilian record on Brazilian soil to put Germany up 2-0. What followed over the next 6 minutes is widely considered the most catastrophic collective meltdown in the history of international sports. Brazil completely lost their minds. They didn't just concede goals, they ceased to function as a professional football team. They became a group of terrified, disoriented individuals trapped in a nightmare from which they could not wake up. 1 minute after Klose's goal, in the 24th minute, Philipp Lahm delivered a cross from the right wing. The ball traveled across the penalty area, completely untouched by any yellow jersey, and found Toni Kroos lurking on the edge of the box. Kroos struck a magnificent half volley with his left foot that flew into the bottom corner. 3-0. The German players celebrated with a sense of clinical satisfaction, while the Brazilian players stared at the grass, their faces pale with shock. Before the television broadcasters could even finish showing the slow-motion replay of the third goal, Germany scored again. It was the 26th minute. Fernandinho, completely overwhelmed by the pressure, was dispossessed immediately after the restart by Toni Kroos just outside his own penalty area. Kroos played a quick, devastating 1-2 with Sami Khedira, slicing the defense apart before tapping the ball into an empty net. 4-0. The stadium was now transitioning from disbelief to outright horror. Grown men in the stands were weeping openly. Children hid their faces in their parents' shirts. But the German onslaught was relentless. In the 29th minute, Sami Khedira, driving forward from midfield, found Mesut Ozil. Ozil calmly rolled the ball back into the path of Khedira, who side-footed it past a completely broken Julio Cesar. 5-0. 5 goals in 29 minutes. 4 goals in a span of just 6 minutes. It was a statistical anomaly, a performance so dominant that it felt like a glitch in reality. The German team did not even celebrate the 5th goal with intensity. They walked back to their half with a quiet, almost respectful solemnity, realizing they were participating in the public destruction of a football nation's soul. Inside the stadium, the atmosphere shifted from a sporting arena to a theater of absolute despair. The passionate singing had turned into a deathly, stunned silence, punctuated only by the sound of sobbing fans. Security guards stood watch, not looking at the pitch, but watching the crowds, fearing immediate civil unrest. In the VIP boxes, political dignitaries and FIFA executives sat in stunned silence, realizing that the narrative of the entire tournament had just been rewritten in half an hour. During the halftime interval, the German dressing room was surprisingly quiet. Joachim Low, showing an extraordinary level of sportsmanship and foresight, issued a strict directive to his players. He told them that they must remain professional, maintain their dignity, and absolutely avoid trying to humiliate or show off against the Brazilians. He knew that the world was watching, and any perceived arrogance could spark an international incident or a riot in the stadium.
On the other side, the Brazilian dressing room was a scene of utter ruin. Players were inconsolable, yelling at each other, staring blankly at the walls, completely shattered by the realization that their names would forever be linked to the greatest humiliation in Brazilian history. Scolari made a couple of substitutions, bringing on Paulinho and Ramirez to try and inject some stability and pride back into the side. When the second half commenced, Brazil showed a brief, desperate surge of pride. They managed to create a few clear-cut chances, forcing the German goalkeeper, Manuel Neuer, to make a series of spectacular, world-class saves. Neuer, playing with the authority of a titan, refused to grant them even a sliver of hope, preserving his clean sheet with an intense competitiveness that showed Germany was still taking the game seriously.
Once that brief Brazilian storm subsided, Germany turned the screw once again, utilizing their substitutes to devastating effect. Andre Schürrle entered the pitch, hungry to leave his mark on the match. In the 69th minute, Philipp Lahm found space on the right flank once more, cutting a precise pass back into the center of the box, where Schürrle casually guided it past Julio Cesar to make it 6-0. The ultimate insult, however, arrived in the 79th minute. Schürrle chased down a lofted pass from Thomas Müller on the left side of the penalty box. From an incredibly tight angle, with almost no room to maneuver, he unleashed a ferocious, rising half volley that crashed off the underside of the crossbar and into the roof of the net. It was a goal of sublime, breathtaking technical quality. 7-0. At this point, something extraordinary happened inside the Estadio Mineirão. The Brazilian fans, completely broken, but recognizing the sheer, unadulterated genius of the football being played before them, stood up and began to applaud the German team. They chanted "Olé" with every pass the Germans made, turning their immense anger and grief into a surreal display of dark humor and resignation. In the 90th minute, Oscar managed to break through the German defensive line, latching on to a long ball and slotting it past Manuel Neuer to make it 7-1. It was the most meaningless goal in the history of the World Cup. Oscar did not celebrate. He looked down at the pitch, his face etched with immense grief. A few seconds later, the referee blew the final whistle, bringing an end to 90 minutes of footballing purgatory.
The immediate aftermath of the match was a surreal, cinematic display of human emotion. Several Brazilian players collapsed onto the pitch, weeping uncontrollably. David Luiz fell to his knees, pointing his hands toward the sky, crying hysterically as he prayed. He would later give a heartbreaking, tear-filled post-match interview, apologizing to the entire nation, stating that he only wanted to see his people smile. The German players, rather than embarking on a wild, chaotic celebration, walked around the pitch, embracing their devastated opponents, offering words of comfort in an incredible display of empathy. Outside the stadium, the country plunged into a state of profound collective mourning and disbelief. The 7-1 defeat, quickly labeled the Mineirazo, completely eclipsed the trauma of the 1950 Maracanazo. It wasn't just a loss.
It was a total systemic collapse that exposed the deep-seated flaws in Brazilian football governance, tactical development, and psychological preparation. Germany would go on to win the tournament, defeating Argentina in the final to lift their 4th World Cup trophy, cementing their place as one of the greatest international teams ever assembled. Meanwhile, Brazil was left to sift through the ashes of a sporting catastrophe that would be talked about for generations. A match where tactical brilliance, emotional fragility, and ruthless efficiency collided to create the most shocking in the history of the beautiful game.